I'm going to be trying to present a slight overview of various topics that I've been interested in for many years, and to try and put the archaeological research that's been carried out by several different projects in the northwestern part of India into a broader archaeological context. So the title is very grand, and that's on purpose, but I'm not actually going to be talking about the entirety of the Indus civilization for very long. But I would like to just sort of put a little bit of a perspective of the types of things that I focus on with my research. So the archaeological evidence for the Indus civilization is largely very well known, and it will be known to this audience. And in many ways, it's interesting in a sense because we have this sort of long-term trajectory of change, in the sense that we see the appearance of urban centres and then ultimately their abandonment. So there's a number of different aspects of the Indus civilization that are broadly of interest. But one of the aspects that I find extremely interesting and important in terms of understanding the way that the ancient populations of the Indus civilization would have had their lives impacted on by various aspects is the nature of the environment and the climate within which they lived. And anyone living in the subcontinent knows that we have these two very distinctive rainfall systems, the winter rain and the summer rainfall system. And they actually have quite specific impact upon the environmental context in different parts of the Indus River Basin. But what's very interesting to me is that the Indus populations of the Indus civilization are distributed across this variety of different climate and environmental zones. So this suggests that there's elements of similarity in terms of the way that people live their lives, but there are also fundamental differences in terms of the types of environments that they encountered in their lives. And that has a variety of different types of impact. It's often been discussed that Indus populations were able to farm in 2 different seasons. And this will have had an impact upon the way that their labor was scheduled and the way that water was available. But importantly, there is differences in terms of the water availability in Gujarat, for example, to the water availability in Sindh and to the water availability in Punjab and different parts of Punjab, whether it would be the west part of Punjab in Pakistan or the eastern part of Punjab and Haryana in northwestern India. And this degree of variability and the way that it intersects with the other aspects is actually really quite important and fundamental. So there's often this tension, I think, in a lot of the literature about the Indus civilization, where there's often a lot of attention drawn to the fact that there's considerable degree of uniformity in terms of material culture, particularly things like the seals, the use of the Indus script, the weight system, and many of these exotic types of raw materials, such as the carnelian, the types of chert that are used, and all of these other sorts of elements. And we know that Indus populations were very good at manufacturing quite technically elaborate material culture. But interesting enough, there's this sort of focus on certain aspects of the material culture actually emphasizes the fact that where similarities lie, but what often is not necessarily focused on is the degree to which there are differences in the categories of material culture as well. And one of the things that we've noticed in our work in northwestern India, particularly in the areas of Haryana and Punjab, is that even within that area itself, there is considerable degrees of variability in the material culture. So another aspect that's quite interesting to me is the fact that the Indus civilization, broadly construed, is actually characterized by different perceptions of what's happening. So there's often a lot of concentration on the existence of the large Indus cities, and there's often arguments about whether or not they might be city-states and the degree to which they maintain political control over large areas. But what's particularly interesting is that the large Indus cities are actually quite some distance apart. And the intervening areas, the areas that where a very high proportion of the population lived, are actually dominated by much smaller settlements, typically falling into the category of towns or villages. So it does suggest that the rural context for the Indus civilization is extremely important. And we know that they're making use of a wide variety of different types of plants and animals. And it's also likely that there's variety in the types of plants and animals that are being used in different periods. Now, to try and understand different ways of life and different types of settlement systems in different regions, we end up having to focus quite often on the distribution of archaeological sites. And we know that there is an abundance of archaeological evidence for the distributions of settlements in many regions of the Indus River Basin. And if we look, however, we plot a sort of density map, it's also quite obvious that there's been quite a lot of focus in terms of archaeological survey on very specific regions, particularly areas that exist in the area of Gujarat and the plains of northwestern India, where a wide range of extensive surveys have been conducted. And the distribution of sites in those areas is marked in contrast to the areas of Punjab in Pakistan and also actually Sindh, where there's much lower densities of archaeological sites. The area in Pakistan that's quite different is the area of Cholestan, with the often referred to large centre in Ganweriwala, where we see a concentration of archaeological sites, which is largely as a result of the extensive surveys conducted by Rafiq Mughal in the 1970s and his team. Now, so what's interesting, I'm not going to discuss the archaeology of all of these regions now, because I don't think that that would be very useful. But what I'm going to do is briefly talk about the archaeology of the region around Harappa, and this will hopefully work quite well in complement with the paper by Arnau Garcia, which will be presented later. And I'll also just mention briefly some of the work that has been conducted by myself and colleagues when they were based in Cambridge, and then largely focus on the work that we've done in northwestern India at the end. Now, we're all very familiar with the archaeology of the site of Harappa, especially from the work of Professor Mark Kanoya, Richard Meadow, Rita Wright, and colleagues that have worked as members of the Harappa Archaeological Research Project. We know that Harappa is a very important Indus site, and it's interesting in the sense that it has multiple mounds of occupation and evidence for a wide range of craft production activities. So and it was also involved in as a sort of hub within a resource acquisition and redistribution network. The work of Rita Wright has also focused on the Beas Landscape and Settlement Survey, and they conducted wide-ranging surveys, but did quite a lot of intensive surveys of individual sites, including the sites of Lahoma, Lal Tiba, and Vainiwal, which are located. Lahoma Lal Tiba is located in relatively close proximity to Harappa, around 25 kilometers away from the city, whereas Vainiwal was located well over 100 kilometers away from the city. And these sorts of assessments of archaeological sites and the detail of the distribution of the material on the surface of the site have made it possible to engage in some consideration of the relationship between the city itself and the regional settlements around it. And these ideas have been most recently sort of brought together in a holistic way by an archaeologist called Justin Jennings, who highlighted the fact that Harappa was likely to have been a very, very large site having in excess of 40,000 people as part of its population. And he argued that the city was probably engaged in processes where inhabitants were engaged in farming and herding and fishing outside of the city itself. But there's a lot of grouping of activities and other sorts of dynamics that were going on within the city itself. But he drew attention to the fact that there was a change in the types of crops that were being grown in Harappa during the urban period, with a shift towards the focus on wheat. He highlighted the fact that there continued to be wild animals brought into the site. So there was hunting going on, provisioning the city. And he drew attention to the fact that Rita Wright and her colleagues had observed that sites like Lahoma, Lal Tiba appeared to be economically reliant on the city and perhaps also the city manufacturers. And this was in contrast to a site like Vainiwal, which was over 100 kilometers away, which appears to have maintained its own local craft specialists and remained independent of the city. So that sets up a little bit of the context of what's happening in Punjab. in Pakistani Punjab. But if we look at Cholestan, we actually see something quite different. So I'm going to talk just briefly about the archaeological work that was done by Rafiq Mughal and contrast that to the more recent research that we've done in Cholestan, and use that then as a way to sort of clarify what it is that we're doing in Northwestern India as well. Now, the archaeological surveys of Cholestan were quite important in terms of identifying hundreds of archaeological sites that were occupied in different periods, particularly focusing on the sort of pre-urban Côte d'Ivoire phase, the urban Harappa phase, and the post-urban or late Harappa phase in the region. Now, there's a number of complex trajectories in terms of the distribution of settlement and how that has been interpreted over time. And importantly, Rafiq Mughal argued that there was quite clear evidence for the existence of settlement hierarchies, and used this as an argument to suggest that Cholestan was critically important in terms of the development of the Indus civilization, and also as a focus of major settlement over extended periods of time. But what is interesting, if you look closely at the data, is that the evidence from Mughal's survey actually suggests that there is very little continuity in occupation between individual periods. And this suggests at a very basic level that the populations of Cholestan were constantly moving and displacing into different locations over time. Now, recognizing that factor encouraged me to work with a master's student at the University of Cambridge called Frank Lynham, and we made use of a statistical algorithm that was developed by Robert Dewar to attempt to assess the degree to which settlements may have been occupied contemporaneously. And by comparing the settlements that were occupied in individual periods and also comparing those with settlements that were occupied in multiple periods, it seemed to be evident that although there are very large numbers of sites, for example, occupied in the mature Harappan period, only one or two of those sites was occupied in the period before or the period after. So that in statistical terms, this suggests that there's quite a high likelihood that most of those settlements were not being occupied at the same time, but perhaps they were being occupied sequentially. So perhaps we see an artificial inflation of the number of settlements in the Cholestan region. And so this emphasizes that not only is there limited evidence for continued settlement over time, but perhaps even we should question the degree to which these settlements represent contemporaneous settlements that are occupied all at the same time. So in a way, this possibly indicates that Cholestan has a very unstable environment. And that is perhaps not a surprise given its proximity to the edges of the Thar Desert, which is shown in the image on the lower right-hand side. So as part of that, as a follow-on from that work, Hector Arengo, Francesc Conesa, who's going to be speaking shortly, and other collaborators that were based in Cambridge on various different research projects, were involved in a program of developing methods of using computers and satellite imagery from either multi-sensor or multi-temporal satellite data to assess the distribution of archaeological sites. And I suspect Francesc will be mentioning this again shortly. What's important about this finding is actually what's visible on the map on the lower right-hand side, is that archaeological sites like Gangweriwala, which were assumed to be particularly large, now appear to be smaller than they were originally recorded. But importantly also that there seems to be at least 4 or maybe 6 sites that are of similar sizes to Gangweriwala, all existing in relatively close proximity in Cholestan. So this suggests that the settlement system in this region is actually quite different to how we previously understood it. There's not one major center. There may have been multiple major sites. Whether or not they were all occupied at the same time is not entirely clear, but it does sort of throw up new ways or new ideas for us to really consider the degree to which we have a clear understanding of the nature of the settlement system in Cholestan and the degree to which it's actually different to what we see around Harappa, for example. So we see considerable variation within different regions of the Indus civilization. at least in that comparison. Now, if we move to northwestern India, the areas of Haryana, northern Rajasthan, and parts of Punjab, the collaborative projects called the Land Water Settlement Project and the Two Rains projects have been running since 2008. And these are a collaboration between Banaras Hindu University and the University of Cambridge, and have also actually involved, I know, a number of people who are listening at the moment. Now, I'm not going to talk about the work in pieces of detail, but what I'm going to do is to briefly give you an overview of some of the results that we've had. And this work very much represents the collaborative endeavours of many different scholars from who are either still in Cambridge or have been based in Cambridge at some point, as well as collaborators in Banaras Hindu University. And we've had linkages to other colleagues and scholars in India as well. They are all mentioned at the end as in part of the thanks. But in many ways, it's clear that the sort of, I guess, the gravitational focus of our research has been the area around the city of Rakhigarhi. We have not actually worked at Rakhigarhi specifically, although, as Akshita mentioned, we've had, there's been some material that was sampled from the site, which we managed to get from through collaboration with Professor Shinde from Deccan College. But Rakhigarhi maintains a very high place of importance and prominence in our understanding of the archaeology of northwestern India. But what we were particularly interested in was understanding the settlements in the areas around these cities to understand the nature of the local economy and the landscape relationships more broadly. We've utilized a number of different methods to try and understand the landscape archaeology. We've made use of historical maps, and the fact that maps that were made over 100 years ago were often documenting archaeological sites. And you can actually see the location of Rakhigarhi on the map on the lower right-hand side. Rakhigarhi is recorded in 1905, as are sites like Lahari Rago 1 and 2 and Masudpur 1 and 7. Dr. Adam Green, who's one of the collaborators on the Two Rains project, developed a method of recording archaeological sites using cloud resources and mobile technology, and was able to work with collaborators from Banaras Hindu University, including Aftab Alam and Amit Ranjan, to engage in a sort of rapid survey of various regions. And this built upon the work that was done earlier by the Land Water Settlement Project. And we were able to identify archaeological sites on the ground using these new technologies, and to combine this rapid mobile phone and tablet technologies to enable us to document archaeological sites very clearly and build up large-scale databases of archaeological site distributions that would allow us to look at the distributions of archaeological sites over time across a large area of northwestern India. We were able to combine that information with reconstructions of the hydrological network of northwestern India as well. Now, those reconstructions were being built on, again, assessments of remote sensing imagery and other sorts of approaches. And what you can see here is a map that combines in light blue the distribution of the many courses of ancient rivers and channels that we've been able to reconstruct across the plains of northwestern India, and the distribution of archaeological sites, which is shown as black dots. Now we can see here, this is the distribution of sites in the early Harappan period, before Rakhigarhi had become a large urban center. But we know this is a period where we have sites that are occupied at the same time, like Banavali, Birana, and also the early phases of Rakhigarhi and Faramana as well. Now, when we see the appearance of Rakhigarhi as an urban center, what we see at a broad regional level is the depopulation of some areas, particularly areas up to the on the northern side of the location of the Gaga River, some areas along the modern Paleo Channel, or the Paleo Channel that's visible in the central part of the map. And we see some degree of depopulation of some areas around Rakhigarhi as well. So the city seems to result from a drawing in of populations, but what's very clear is that many areas see new settlements being established, and also displacement and movement of population. So we see two different types of processes happening at the same time. We also see change after the urban period, where we see Rakigari appears to have been abandoned, and we see displacement of populations into the surrounding regions. And often those villages that are established are located in relatively close proximity to each other. So there does appear to be some clustering of settlement. Now, just to talk briefly about the archaeological evidence that we've obtained from our more focused work, we've done excavations at a number of sites in the area which are downstream from Rakigari, or maybe you could flip that around and say Rakigari is upstream from these villages that we've investigated. And we've focused primarily on the sites of Masudpur 1, Masudpur 7, and Lohari Rago, which are all relatively modest village-sized sites, and they're located within 15 kilometers of Rakigari. So they're actually located closer to Rakigari than the site of Lahoma Lal Tiba is to the site of Harappa. So we have a much more closer understanding of the nature of the, I guess what you could call the economic hinterland of the city, of the Indus city that we're actually in close proximity to. Now, what we've done as part of that work is to focus on the landscape and the environment, and to try and understand the nature of water availability in this location. We've been able to identify the fact that although there is no large channel visible on the modern ground surface, there does appear to be traces of a relatively small paleo channel, which you can see is this purple colored wiggly line that runs across the map. And it goes past Rakigari, it goes past Lohari Rago 1, past Masudpur 1, and past Masudpur 7, and weaves its way all the way across, and it eventually joins up with a number of other paleo channels all the way to the west in parts of northern Rajasthan. So we've combined this sort of remote sensing analysis with some quite detailed assessment of, this is the archaeological site of Masudpur 1, but this shows you the type of underground coring work that's been carried out by a PhD student from Cambridge called Joanna Walker. And she did a systematic coring of the areas around these settlements that we excavated. And this revealed effectively a hidden underground landscape that shows the relationship between the archaeological sites, the paleo channels, and particular areas in the surrounding location that may have been suitable for farming practices and other sorts of things. We also conducted detailed surface collections of sites like Lohari Rago, which have made it possible to make an assessment of the distribution of occupation in different periods. And we've conducted excavations at Lohari Rago and Masudpur in the last 3 or 4 years. And this builds on excavations that were carried out at Masudpur 1 and Masudpur 7 in 2009. Now, what our excavations have shown is that we have a very distinctive local material culture assemblage that seems to show some reflection of the type of I guess what Akinori Uesugi described as a classic Harappan or Indus material ceramic assemblage, but it's very much one that has a local flavor. We have ceramic vessels that appear relatively specific in their form and variety, but they don't match the sort of the classic types of Harappan vessels that we see elsewhere, and especially some of the types that we see at Rakigari. These analysis of this material by people like Danica Parik and Alessandro Ceccherli have highlighted this. A lot of this material is locally made, and it does display a very distinctive set of ceramic production techniques as well. We do, however, have some indications that the populations of these small villages are very clearly interacting with the broader networks of connectivity. We have steatite beads, lapis lazuli beads, carnelian beads, all of which are coming from outside of the local area. If we try and understand how the people were living in these settlements, we're looking at the Archaeo-Botanical Evidence, and we can see that there was clear evidence for the use of winter and summer crops, both before the appearance of Rakigari and during the occupation at Rakigari and afterwards. So it doesn't appear as though the population made changes in their farming system directly as a result of of urbanism, for example, or necessarily as a result of climate processes. And this is possibly most, well, what was one of the things, several things are quite interesting. One of them is the fact that they were using millet and rice before the appearance of rakigari, and wheat and barley also. And some of these findings were surprising in some respects, but not in many ways also not unexpected. Looking at the different assemblages of archaeobotanical material from a range of different sites, you can see each of the sites is shown in one of the vertical columns, and the horizontal rows change over time. So the earliest material is at the bottom of the chart, and we can see actually at each of the different sites, we see different combinations of crops being grown, or at least making it into the archaeological record. And this is interesting in many respects, because it suggests that there's not a standardized assemblage of crops that were being used by the populations living in these settlements. And what's particularly interesting, if we contrast Masudpur 1 and Masudpur 7, is that we see over time at one of these villages, we see change in the focus of the crop assemblage from one that was focused on millet to one that was focused on wheat and barley, to one that was focused on millet and rice in contrast to wheat and barley. So this suggests that the farmers were making flexible decisions and choices. And then if we compare the two pie charts in the middle, these two sites appear to have been occupied at the same time, but the crop assemblages at each of those sites are actually quite different. So this suggests to us that there's a considerable degree of variability in the farming system. Now, Aksheta talked about this briefly, so I'm not necessarily going to mention it, but it was interesting that there is quite a degree of standardization in terms of the types of food that was being consumed by the cattle and water buffalo at the settlements that we analysed in northwestern India. And we've also conducted some analysis of the strontium stable isotopes that were from animal teeth at the sites that we've looked at in northwestern India, and we've contrasted those strontium results to the evidence that's come from the analysis of sites in Pakistan and sites in Gujarat, and also the material that's been published from Harappa. Now, what's very, very interesting about the evidence that's coming from the strontium analysis at material from different sites is that there appears to be relatively limited movement of animals between different regions. So especially at villages, the animals appear to have been involved in a local production economy, and they're not moving very, very far. However, if you look at the samples that are associated with Rakigari and Harappa, which is shown here in the orange bars, you can see that some of the animals that are being found at Rakigari and some of the animals that were being found at Harappa appear to be coming from different regions. So this is actually quite interesting because it suggests that the cities themselves may have been involved in actual long-range interaction with each other and potentially with other settlements in other regions as well. Now, to tie all of this together, we're also engaging in some agent-based modelling, which is a whole nother separate topic, but I just wanted to mention that briefly to try and understand how people were making these decisions to live in these environments. And just to sort of briefly include, I think it's important to re-emphasise the significance of rural settlement in the Indus context. It's important to be conscious that northwestern India is very diverse environmentally and hydrologically, but so is the whole of the Indus region. And I would like to emphasize that the settlement system that characterizes the Indus civilization is very dynamic and very changeable. People made use of different water sources at different times. Rural settlements were extremely important, but the climate itself was also very, very variable, and populations needed to be aware of variability and complexity and change. So this very, very quick overview, which had a lot of detail, is the result of a work of a lot of people. The land water settlement and two rains projects have run for a long time, and with permission from the Archaeological Survey of India. And we're now continuing our work with a new project called Mapping Archaeological Heritage in South Asia, which is setting out to try and collaborate with scholars at a range of different universities to try and systematically map archaeological sites in many, many regions. And I'd just like to thank all of my collaborators and co-contributors to the work. It wouldn't have happened without all of these people as well. Thank you.